I'm really excited to be here today with Dr. Daniel Toma and Ted Stiritz, and we're going to be talking about Dr. Toma's book. Dr. Toma is a professor of biological sciences at Minnesota State University in Mankato, Minnesota. And he's in the behavioral sciences, he's research in behavioral genetics of the fruit fly. He's in the biological sciences department. And he's written a book, which I have not read. It's on my list, but Ted has read it. And so these two are going to talk about this wonderful book. Ted and I did talk about the chapter one a couple of weeks ago. And today they're going to be talking about chapters 2 and 3. And for the share screen, I just wanted to bring up a picture of the book so people would. So can you all see this picture of the book?
Yeah.
Yep, that's it.
The Vestige of Eden, Image of Eternity, Common Experience, the Hierarchy of Being and Modern Science. I love the title. I truly love the title. But when I saw that picture, I just thought, I have to show this. This is just so crazy. So when I first started painting years and years ago, this was one of the first paintings that can you see that?
Wow. Okay, yeah.
You can see this painting of an amaryllis. It's one of the first paintings that I did really large. It's about 2 feet by 2.5 feet. And I had to submit a poem to go with it because that was the kind of show that it was. So I wrote a poem. So I'm going to read you my Amaryllis Chronicles. Radiant in red, sun-splashed, you stand, robed in riches beyond the adornment of the kings and queens of Narnia. Receiver of gifts unsought, unearned, bow your haloed head in praise and show forth your joy. So fantastic. That's what your book cover made me think of.
Well, I didn't, to be honest, I didn't know it was an Amarillo. The publisher picked the book cover for me, so now I know what type of flower it is.
Well, I'm going to give you one that's even funnier. I haven't actually gone and looked at the taxonomy, but it says that it's a bugle lily. So I know there's a whole bunch of closely related lilies, amaryllis. There's a crinum lily that looks like that that's really popular here in the South. So it probably just the same genus. And as a non-botanist, I couldn't tell them apart.
Well, I'm learning a lot about different flowers right now because my wife planted a whole bunch of different flowers in our garden this year. So she got into that. So about 400 square feet of flowers.
Very cool. Well, so Dr. Toma, Dan, you are a scientist, and yet you've written a book about the vestige of Eden. So how did that happen? What was there in your background that brought you to the point of writing a book about this?
Well, I came from sort of a mixed religious background. First off, thank you for having me and having this podcast. I really appreciate it. And
so your sound is fading in and out. Every time you move, it fades in and out. So I wonder where your mic is.
Well, the mic is on the computer, so is that okay? Or
yeah, why don't you just crank it up a little bit?
I'll try to. So I thought I had it up all the way.
It sounds better now, but maybe that's because you're closer.
How was that? Is it better?
Yeah, keep talking.
Okay. Yeah, I checked it all out before I logged in. Okay, sorry. So how did I get? So my I come from a mixed religious background, so that sort of started getting me curious about my dad was a Southern Baptist, my mom was a Roman Catholic, and so when I went into college, I had a lot of questions about religion, and I was very seeking the idea of meaning for my life and everything, and so I started really reading a lot of philosophy and theology, even though I didn't major in it. And so as I developed the scientific career, I started thinking about, well, is there a tradition in the Christian especially Catholic teaching about the structure of the universe and the structure of creation, and is there something revealed about that beyond just what we can learn from our reason, from what we're looking outside? Is there something deeper to that? And so that led me to a long engagement with the church fathers and St. Thomas, and I came across this idea that the liturgy, and you could also use the idea of the church, it'd be the same structure, but the idea of the liturgy, what we call the mass, is sort of the blueprint or the superstructure for all of creation. So everything's modeled on that to a greater or lesser degree. And so vestige of Eden means the original liturgical structure of the universe before the fall of Adam and Eve, and then the image of eternity would be the church. That is the new creation that is sort of reconstituting this original idea. And so that's sort of how I came upon that. And I thought, well, is there a way of, does that relate to science in any way? Does it structure? So my personal idea, that it must somehow connect to it. And so I started when I started reading St. Thomas Aquinas, when I read some of his treatises, he has sort of a natural liturgical analog for this in one of his treatises. That's like the whole book got put together. So the idea, here's the liturgy or the mass as the blueprint for creation. And then he sort of provided a connection for me with science. And so I use that connection in there and link it down to science. And so that's how the whole book came to be. And so it was a long multi-year effort or decade effort, I should say, a couple decades that I sort of came to this understanding.
Well, the obvious question that jumps into my head is, and I'm just going to speak as let's say a person who doesn't know anything about anything. Let's say I didn't know anything about the Bible or history or science or anything. When you say that the liturgy is the blueprint for creation, the liturgy obviously came after the creation. So how did is it that we look at the universe through the lens of the liturgy, or is it that you're saying that the universe actually was created by that pattern and then the liturgy sort of grew out of our natural understanding of the patterns of the universe?
So we're, from humans, we look at it from the standpoint of just like building a house. So we look at it from the standpoint of the bricks and the mortar and the wood and so forth. But I would say that God looks at it from his original pattern that he had in his mind. So his intention was always this liturgical structure. And so that's the way he created it. And so there was an original liturgical structure with Eden. And sort of the tradition of the church fathers is that Adam's job was sort of in Eden was, for lack of a better term, job was a type of contemplation of God, and he would order the rest of creation around this liturgical structure in Eden. So Eden had, so it says in the Bible, the fruits of the lower part of Eden was good for fruits, and this is what we call purgation. So the fathers of the church have got a threefold structure of the liturgy: purgation, illumination, and union. And then the tree of the knowledge of good and evil was illumination, knowledge of good, so, and then the tree of life was union. And so this is a structure, liturgical structure. And so that's the idea that God had in his mind. And then there's the idea, sort of the eschatological idea, where the future, in other words, so the new liturgy, the liturgy of the church is the liturgy in heaven, the eternal liturgy. And so everything's being modeled after that. So we're sort of participating in already what is in our future. So we're sort of living somewhat our future, and everything is being modeled and drawn after that as a type of as a type of giant magnet or cause, if you would say, that draws things and organizes things around it. So just like the idea of a carpenter or an architect, they have the idea of a building, and that's the blueprint, and then everybody follows the blueprint when you put things together, sometimes unconsciously and sometimes not. And so sometimes we're doing this unconsciously and nature's doing this unconsciously, but the blueprint is the liturgy that's being sort of followed. Everything's sort of being drawn into that.
And if I can interject, you can, to drill down into the biblical narrative as well, you can actually see this with the tabernacle and the temple. Right. So
right.
Moses,
I was thinking about that. Yeah.
Yes. So Moses is given the tabernacle, but it's very clear that he's given that because it's patterned after a heavenly reality. So it's like at a particular moment that tabernacle enters reality. It's been there. And then you see, looking forward, you see that pattern, if you will, all of creation being taken up into that in the eschaton. And what's interesting, and Dr. Toma, until this point, it hadn't really clicked with me, but even the Jewish temple, you see that purgation, illumination, union, with the outer courts, where there's the sacrifice for purgation, and then you have the holy place where there's the lampstands and the law, and then you have for illumination, and then the Holy of Holies where there's union with God. That's actually a really cool way of seeing that, and so you get that pattern over and over and over. And your notion, and to me, this, so coming to this as a Protestant, and I think I was asking kind of the same questions as Karen is now when I first read your book. I mean, it really really shook me up to read this. It flipped the whole world around for me, really, to say, because my thought is, well, we look at the world around us and we come up with these ways to worship God. And the notion, as I understood it, is something much more like, no, that pattern is, well, it's pre-fall because, and it's outside of, let's say, physical reality, because the angelic hierarchies also have that threefold pattern of purgation,
Right.
elimination, and union. And so we're actually, as you say, being created reality is being drawn towards that. Like, that's actually more true. The liturgy, in some sense, is more true than the stuff that we look around and see.
Right. So yeah. So the church fathers would say that it is the figure of future reality. It's and so you're mentioning about the notion about the Jewish temple.
Okay, so I got to jump in and ask another question, because you're right on my wheelhouse right here. That being drawn towards that, because I really see that in so many areas of science. So explain to us, what is purgation, what is illumination, and what is union?
Okay, that's okay. So first off,
I mean, you don't have to do the whole book. Just give me
I won't. No, I won't. I'm trying to figure out how to condense it down here. So let's just start with the notion of, okay, so the church fathers would say there's three parts of the liturgy: purgation, illumination, union. So you walk into if you ever experienced a mass or not, so you walk into the liturgical service of the mass, and there's the initial readings, the Psalms, and the use from the Old and New Testament, and that is supposed to orient you away from your concerns of the world, purging you of your concerns for the world, orienting you to something higher. And then it follows to what's called the Nicene Creed, which is the Creed of Nicaea. And then if you remember the story from Scripture about Christ after the resurrection, on the road to Emmaus, the disciples were walking and talking, and he sort of appeared to them. They didn't know who he was, and then they got to Emmaus and they invited him in, and they said the breaking of the bread, which is a liturgical symbol. And all of a sudden, they realized who he was, and he vanished from there. So illumination. And then finally union, which would be the reception of and they would say you have the Our Father, where you start realizing you're a child of God. So that's the next sequence. And then you have the reception of the Eucharist. So you become one with God through the reception of the Eucharist. So purgation, illumination, and union. And so St. Thomas provides a natural analog with that in one of his treatises, Summa Contra Gentiles, where he talks about, and I think you two of you mentioned this briefly during your previous podcast about the book, and where he talks about the intensification or development of interiority. If you look at the hierarchy of being, so he makes the hierarchy of being, in the material universe. We'll just stick with that. Humans, animals, and plants. And we could say, well, there's bacteria and fungi that we know by science nowadays. We'll set that aside. That's easily dealt with, but we'll just set that aside for the moment. So he talks about, if you look at plants, they depend on things outside of themselves. They have to draw in water and minerals, but they fundamentally transform them, and then the product is a flower and then fruit. So there's a transient interiorization where things are drawn from the outside, then transform fundamentally into something else. And so we say that they're purging matter of this wrapping in on itself of a non-living non-life. So like a billiard ball is just, billiard ball moves by one billiard ball knocking into the next billiard ball. And so it's a purely external type of movement. So do atoms that way. The one knocks into the other, and it's a chemical reaction. So plants have the first interiorization. So there's an interiorization. So they're purging matter of its wrapped in on itself. They're organizing to something higher. And then animals have a type of knowledge. It's knowledge of the individual. And so they depend on things on the outside. They sense light, and they smell things and so forth. They see things, hear things, smell things, feel things. But then they have a memory, so it terminates inside into a memory. So there's an intensification and interiorization. So the product of knowledge does not pass outside like it does with a plant. It stays in terms of their memory. And then with humans, we depend on things for our intellectual knowledge. We learn things about the outside, but then we can conceive of something and think of something that doesn't exist at all in the material world, that we don't see, like the idea of like I mentioned in the book, the perfect notion of a triangle, or the idea of an apple. So everybody can share a material apple. If I bite a piece of an apple, you can't have the same piece, but the idea of an apple violates that basic notion of materiality, because both of us can share the same idea of an apple. So we can start thinking of things and conceiving of things while we're initially dependent for our information from the outside. The genesis finally and the termination of that idea of something non-material occurs inside of us, and so there's a further intensification. We pass on to angels after that, and so theology would say that angels are just given the general idea, like the general idea of a human. They can conclude all the particulars, and so they're not dependent on any of their thought process for something external to them. And so that's the idea of increasing interiorization, and it sort of fits this liturgical analog, because you have plants which purging things, animals which have a knowledge of something, the first waking of knowledge, true knowledge, the knowledge of the individual, and then finally humans which unify these things. We have both the ability of plants, we can grow and reproduce, we can have sensory knowledge, and then we can have intellectual knowledge. So we sort of bring the whole of the material universe. So we're sort of the kings, or the church fathers would say the priests of the material universe. We unite the whole of all the functions of materiality, and then go beyond that within us. And so purgation, illumination, and union.
Well, so let me throw a triad at you and see if this fits at all. Dorothy Sayers wrote this wonderful book, The Mind of the Maker, about the process of making art and how it relates to what she sees as like the general structure of the universe. And she talks about the idea, the energy, and the power. And they roughly relate to the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit.
Right.
But the way that it runs in the making of art is that the idea is that first, the idea comes into the mind, I'm going to paint something. And then the energy is the working out of the painting, the actual process of the painting, the action. And,
right.
then the power is the reception of the painting by the viewer, or the communication that takes place between the artist and the viewer through the viewing of the painting. So the painting itself in some sense, carries the power of both the idea and the process. And so, like, if you think of the Father as the idea, and then the Son as the action, the energy, the working out of the story, let's say, and then the Holy Spirit as taking that story and spreading it throughout all of humanity, so that the communication is happening. And but it lines up with this making of a piece of art. And I have my own theory about how the principles of art tie into all of this, but I just wondered if that works at all with this purgation, illumination, and union.
Yes, I think it would. I mean, the latter part would probably seem most confusing about this notion about the reception, but the old tradition of the church is so we say, it's always somewhat of a danger to take, to try to explain God all the way down into different pieces, because we would say he's an infinite being. We'd say he's an infinite, we wouldn't say being, but he's an infinite. Yeah. So,
yes, that's right.
Beyond
sense, but yeah. So, but we appropriate various things. Theology says you appropriate various things of the persons of the Trinity, like all of them are involved in creation. But on the other hand, we would say like the Holy Spirit is the sanctifier, so if in the Nicene Creed, you would say the Lord, the giver of life. And so he's the sanctifier. And so, yes, he's the one that sort of takes these ideas that you would say and instantiates them into reality. And so it fits somewhat loosely what you're talking about. You have the origin of the Trinity with the Father, and then you have the revelation of that with the Son. I guess you would say you would say the way it's put in things. So John, I guess in the beginning of John, the prologue of John, says, in the beginning was the Word, and all things were created through him. And so everything's organized and created through him. And then the Holy Spirit would be that which, he's sort of, developing everything along those lines. He's sort of infusing it through everything, so there's the archetype, which is the Son, and then the Holy Spirit is the unction of that, so to speak, I guess you could say.
Well, so the reason I brought it up is I'm trying to clarify this idea of purgation. So purgation is the orienting towards the highest good.
Right. It's removing. It's the orienting towards something higher. Purging. Yeah. So
Okay.
it's yeah, the word purge.
So like in Jordan Peterson's world, the first
Jordan
thing you
Peterson's
have to
actually
do is
mentioned that.
orienting towar's the highest good. That's
Right.
the first step, right?
So,
Right.
and in the East, you've got the notion of metanoia, and I'm a little frustrated with the way that kind of repentance gets dragged in the dirt, especially compared to the term metanoia, because
Yeah.
repentance, the notion of repentance is exactly that, and I actually think that St. Thomas's comparison or analog or just realization that this is going on in the material universe,
Right.
that transition point from non-living to living is so fundamental, right?
Right.
That it's something like conversion, because it's kind of like once you're once you're on the train, you can go somewhere, but
Right.
like if you've got people and rocks, all the people are going to die, because we can't
Right.
eat rocks. It doesn't matter how you cook them. There's a reason that story stone soup is a funny story, because it doesn't matter how long you cook the stones, they're never going to turn it. And so it's that but I wanted to, Karen, if I can interject, this something, I think this will connect really well with some of the people listening to this. So Dr. Toma, you're talking about that movement from
Dan is fine. Yeah.
Okay, Dan. I'm sorry.
That's okay. Yeah.
I love titles. Anyway, so when you look at what's going on there, and if you're not familiar with the liturgy in particular, you might not see how important that last step is. And so I want to actually focus on what we're doing right now, and because animals don't get on webcasts and talk to each other, right? There's this what happens when you get to that last step of interiorization. It's not the last step of interiorization, but that step of interiorization from the other animals to the rational and spiritual animals, which is people. All of a sudden, the capacity for charity starts to exist, right? Because as you were saying, Dan, you can only share a material apple so far, right? You could go and start giving out the books in your office, and you'd run out really quickly. But you can get on with me and Karen, and you can take the intellectual wisdom that you have and share it with everyone in the universe.
Right. So a book is a good example. So, I mean, I could give you a copy of a book and I could never read it again, or we both could read the content. We both know the same thing. So there's something in there that violates basic physical rules because it's a higher type of
yes.
Yeah. No, it is. I mean, it's violating. It's in because you can't take the same material thing and share it equally. I mean, I'm either going to get a piece or you're going to get a piece, but we both can't have the exact same bite of an apple. We both can't possess the book at the same time, but we certainly can understand the idea of an apple and 100%. And that your understanding of the idea of an apple doesn't diminish my understanding one bit. As a matter of fact, by discussing it enriches it, where that's not the case with eating an apple. Once you've eaten it, there's no way I can be enriched by that same bite. And the same thing with a book. You can possess a book, or I can possess the same book, or we both can read the same content, and we both have the same idea because there's something in there that's not material, that doesn't jive with material reality. The thought doesn't fit with physical laws. And a thought is something.
Well, and that makes me think.
Yeah.
Yes, exactly. So that makes me think of, and I know that this runs all through the church's tradition, but my particular point of contact with it is in the Divine Comedy, where they talk about how heaven is that place where the more souls there are to share in the glory of God, the more everyone else gets to experience it. And so there's this flip from this sort of degree of scarcity with materiality, right? Where you can't occupy the same material space, to when you move out of that into the place of the spiritual. Now all of a sudden it's actually, the more people there are, the more there is to go around. And I do mean persons, of all kinds, all the kinds of persons, angels, the three persons of the Trinity. And so there's this fundamental switch that happens there. And all of a sudden let's say you get the third dimension to reality, or the fourth, this space gets a lot bigger. Things get a lot bigger when you start being able to have that degree of interiorization where you can share without losing.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. I think where was it said that so again, then building on this notion of materiality versus non-materiality. I forget who was it that I've read it a couple times now, and I forget. Anyway, the idea is that in hell, you want desperately to see, you're totally alone, you want desperately to see the face of the other, but everybody is tied back to, it's just a metaphor, everybody's tied back to back, and so nobody can see the, and so again, there's this, you're occupying there's two spaces, and they can't ever be bridged or shared. Where in the flip side of that is, there's the perception of the face, which allows you to perceive into somebody much deeper. The eyes are the way of the soul. So
yeah. Karen, what do you,
well, we jumped right into it, didn't we? Because we were supposed to start with part 2, which, as I understand it, leads from nature science into philosophy, and then from philosophy to theology. So what do you, in part 2, what do you talk about in terms of nature and science?
Well, part 2, the key part to part 2 was St. Thomas's notion of interiority. So everything's built around that, really. The increase in interiority as you go. So there's a hierarchy of being that we perceive. So I laid the groundwork in the first part that there is a natural hierarchy to the world, and that's sort of a self, that things are organized hierarchically, and that's sort of a self-evident. It's just obvious to a person that goes out and looks at nature. There's a natural hierarchy, and we organize everything hierarchically, whether we want to agree with that or not. Like right now, there's several things going on in the room that I'm in. My dog, I don't know if you can hear it, but he's upstairs barking and so forth. And so I can tune these out because I can organize things hierarchically. And you do when you're interacting with another person, you tune everything out and you focus on one thing. So that's the way you work. And so there's a hierarchy to nature, and then this hierarchy is organized according to St. Thomas, according to this increasing depth of interiority. And it struck me with that the processes of science and what we discover in nature and the processes of science really fit into this. For instance, let me take a convenient example. So if you look in the fossil record, for instance, you'll find what's called the fossil records of the body plan of organisms. So like in the more ancient lower organisms, there's an asymmetric body plan, like a sponge. So the living sponge, it's a group of cells, it filters things, but it's you can just take a chunk off a sponge and there's no real organization to it, in terms of whatever part you pull off. Going up,
you can put them in blenders. Actually,
yeah, put them in blenders, yes.
Yeah, and they'll reconstitute as a new sponge. So,
and so then you go up from that to what are called like the cnidarians, the jellyfish, the animals that have what's called
radially symmetric.
Thank you. I think the radial, the word radial just skipped out of my mind. Radial body plan, and you can cut it like a pie, and whatever slice you take, you'll get the exact same duplication of another slice. You get the same neural organization of the next slice, and so it's organized, but it's organized radially. And then you move up to what are called bilateral organisms, like you and me, where if you split us right down the center, we have it's equal. And so the predominant evolutionary explanation, not that this is wrong or something, but I'm trying to point to something higher in the book beyond that. But so the predominant evolutionary explanation is that things are being organized. So in a bilateral organism, it has all its senses. So you can split it down the center, but it has all its senses up front, sight, taste, smell, hearing, and then the visceral, digestion and reproduction down below. And the dominant biological explanation is that, okay, well, all your senses are up front. You can see your predators and avoid them, and you can see your prey, and it makes you more efficient, and it makes you able to survive better, and so you produce more offspring and survival of the fittest, so to speak. Well, you can also simply sit there, okay, that's fine, but you can also say, if we look at it from what St. Thomas was talking about, and also the church fathers were talking about in this purgation, illumination, and union, it's being organized for the senses to come up to the front to make it a more efficient knowing organism for the reception of a rational soul. It's more efficient to gather knowledge this way. All the senses are up here, the brain to integrate all the senses and allow you to think. So everything's up there. So that's a different way of looking at it. It's looking at it from the standpoint, it's being organized for the reception of something higher. Not that the evolutionary paradigm is wrong. Even actually some of the church fathers actually said, when actually gave an accommodation with evolution. When Adam fell, they said that we fell just just almost to the level of animals. So we fell from this notion of what they would call freedom in being persons down to the level of an individuality, which is like an ant. So we'd sort of hovering right above animality. We still have some key things that makes us human and above animals, but we fell literally right down to the level of how they are. So we think about things in terms of how am I going to get through the day? How am I going to provide for my family? Which are all needed things, but they become almost obsessions with us and our neuroses and psychoses and everything like that. Whereas this, like it says again in Genesis, it would say that, the lower portions of Eden were, contained fruit for Adam and Eve. And so they weren't concerned about the basic necessities of life, so they were oriented to something higher. And so organisms and things are being organized. If you look at the scientific, so I can take the exact same, my point is I can take the exact same scientific data, the data of organization that you find in the fossil record of asymmetric radial and bilateral organisms, that most biologists would say are being organized for organisms to survive. And I can use the same idea and say, well, I'm not altering this data a bit. I'm not, changing it. I'm not getting something new, but I'm just looking at it exactly like you're looking at it. And I can say, well, it's being organized for the soul, the reception of the soul. And so science really needs, a paradigm under which to think. Science will give us the facts, but those facts need some other type of philosophical or theological framework to interpret them in. And so what I'm doing in part 2 is I'm providing a different framework via St. Thomas and via the church fathers, St. Thomas Aquinas and the church fathers, a different way of interpreting this. As opposed to the standard biological paradigm.
If I can add something to that, I mean, there's like every time you say anything, there's about 5 things I want to pick up on. But attention came up a little bit ago, and Jonathan Peugeot, I don't know if you've heard of any of his stuff.
Yeah, I just was watching a podcast with him with Jordan Peterson.
Okay, so he's been blowing the attention horn for years now, and how fundamental attention and the way that we organize our attention and that we organize in hierarchies, and how important where we give our attention is. And so one of the things that struck me as you're talking about that there's this direct connection in terms of, let's say, the biological capacity for interiorization and the capacity to give attention to how focused that attention is. So you think about like plants, I don't know to what degree you could call them having any sense of attention. There's not a directionality to plants at all. But as you move through that sort of those types of symmetry, you actually have an increased capacity for attention giving, right? I'm even thinking about because there are, so for instance, Dan, I don't know if you know this, there's some cnidarians that do have eyes where the mechanisms of the eyes are more or less equivalent to, say, highly evolved mammals. But there's nothing, it's not connecting to anything. It's just a super basic nerve net in there. And so, and then you even see that with the fact that they're sprouting out everywhere, right? So they're not using the eyes to direct themselves to things. It's sort of this basic environmental sensation. And you see that, I'm sure you could sit there and think of 50 examples in about 2 minutes. But as you move up, there's this I think about things like the ability to slew your neck around, right? So, and then going from, say, a lot of birds have eyes on the sides of their heads, so they get, near 360 degrees, but they have depth perception to this sort of this moving in towards binocular vision and all these. You can see the biological orienting towards, let's say, more focused attention in a very
it's focused on what we say that animals have knowledge of the particular, more focused on the particular individual thing, which actually also paves the way for higher knowledge for us to be able to integrate things for rational thought.
Well, on this issue of not focusing on the particular, I've been reading this book. I can't remember the name of the author, but it's called The Mystery of Physical Life. It's an old book, maybe 100 years old. I don't know. Really, really great book. But in there, he's making he's got some theories that he's just thinking about. And I think the history of neuroscience would show that he was probably right in his thinking, but he was thinking about it before they got into all this neuroscience stuff. And he was talking about seeing and hearing and the other senses as being fundamentally inhibitory. That there is so much to see It's a combinatorially explosive. He doesn't use that terminology, but he's saying the world of possible things to see is too large. And so for sight to become more and more useful, it has to become more and more inhibitory. And hearing the same way, that there has to be these inhibitory mechanisms, which makes me think about Ian McGilchrist talking about how the two hemispheres of the brain, most of their capacity are spent in these inhibitory functions. One side will inhibit the other side for certain reasons, and the other side will inhibit this side for certain reasons. And so my ideas are always connected to a lot of things. But at the same time, I've been watching a series by Chris Fields, who's a physicist, and he's talking about quantum reference frames. I mean, I know this is all very weird, but he has this circle where he's showing the three parts. One would be learning, one would be memory, and one would be thermodynamics. And this is true even for getting down into quantum particles and states and things like this. The more space that memory takes up, the less space there is for learning to take place. So if you want more learning, you have to reduce the space for memory. And I was thinking about that in terms of even how we react as organisms, as beings. When certain memories are loaded with emotion, you can have a memory of having been attacked or something in the past, and that memory might come back to you. And then that memory floods your being with either flight or fight and reduces your opportunity for learning. So if you can inhibit that memory and say instead, this is a learning opportunity, I'm going to use that memory space for learning rather than using that memory space for memory. And
yeah, you're bringing up about 10 different things I want to talk about.
Yes. Okay. Well, I'll stop here then, because I just think it's a fascinating overview.
Yeah.
Well, first off, go ahead, Ted.
Oh, I was just going to say, whatever you want to start on that. There's so much there.
Well, first off, what you described is in terms of the first thing about the neuroscience saying you limit this or limit that. You described a hierarchically functioning organism. That's what it is. So in other words, the senses are the neurology and the senses by focusing on one thing. That's just what there's a million things going on around you, and you have to hierarchically organize the stimuli if you want to get anywhere. And so that's we alluded to a little bit before. We're hierarchical. If there's several things going on in the room I'm sitting in, I just ignore them, and or else I can when Ted has a question, we focus on him, and then when Karen has a question, we focus on her. So we sort of phase in on just on one person or a comment. And so so what you described is sort of hierarchical. This is the way organisms hierarchically organize themselves by phasing in and out. And then what was the last point you brought up? There's something else.
Learning and memory, and how there's only so much space. So if you're using up your space for memory, then that reduces the amount of space for learning.
Is that? I want to interject on that, because I was actually having a conversation similar to this with someone. Do you mean in terms of your consciousness, or in terms of, like, say, your mind? Because I don't think there's any evidence, and Dan, you might know more about this than me, that there's really any bottom in terms of the amount that we can remember. I mean, like, the little bit that I've seen in terms of people have certain traumatic.
I think it's, well, okay, so he's not talking about at the human level at all. Okay. He's talking about at the fundamental level of organization of matter.
Oh, interesting. So,
yeah, but when I was talking about it, because your book, part of the title of your book is Common Experience. And I happen to think that's the way the whole universe works. The things that are working down at the particle level are working the same way at the human level, and at the higher, everything is lined up, right? So right. If we go back to Ted's question about what I was thinking about, I was thinking specifically, I had a conversation with someone recently about how in some ways I was processing information wrong from my childhood, because I was allowing certain memories that I didn't even have access to, but those memories were putting me in a particular state where I would react to the memory without even being aware that that memory was causing that reaction. And as I thought it through and I kind of started getting reprogrammed on this whole thing, that, okay, let me put it this way. When you're in a place where things are going wrong or you're feeling uncomfortable, there are certain things that we have a go-to that we go to make ourselves feel better in that state. Let's say for me, it was chocolate. Okay. My go-to is chocolate. I'm going to feel better when I get in a difficult state. But every one of those states is based on some kind of a memory that's associated with what's happening now. What those states actually are is God speaking to me saying, this is a learning opportunity. And if you will come to me in this moment, I have something to teach you, rather than letting this memory rule you right now. Let me teach you what is in this moment. But if you're going to your go-to, you can't hear me.
Right. Yeah.
I have something to teach you. So the learning opportunity,
well,
you have to let go of the memory in order to get the learning opportunity.
That's purgation. I mean, that's right, Dan. Like that's something like the notion of purgation is that you've got sort of these like idolatrous or wrong ways of viewing the world, and you're saying I'm going to turn from that consciously or not. You know, whether or not I'm conscious of it, right? And if you're going to be illuminated, you have to first be purged of your wrong ways.
Well, and you have to be purged of among my closest friends, my top few closest friends is a professional psychologist, and he was telling me on the phone the other night. He's got a very strong background in theology and philosophy. We talk about every other day or so, every few days. And he was mentioning that the tie-in. He says that over the years he's really realized the tie-in between psychology and spirituality. They overlap quite a bit. In other words, the psychology, we could say loosely, is the science of the emotions. You know, how to get the emotions under control. That brings you back to you were talking about how this emotional upwelling can interfere with thoughts and so forth. And that goes back to the Greek, the Greek philosophers, Aristotle and so forth, that until your emotions are properly organized and controlled, it's very hard to think. And everybody, like when you get an adrenaline rush, you can't think very well. It's the fight or flight mechanism that kicks in. And so you're right with the notion about your chocolate or your go-to thing. It's you become, for lack of a better term, you become obsessed with some particular to help you out, as opposed to focusing on the learning experience of that. And so it's learning to order into sort of order in terms of purging. So St. Thomas actually calls purgation. He actually gives them different terms in addition to purgation. So one of the purgation, he gives them the term order. He says order or organizing. And so you're order and organizing yourself. You're arranging yourself for the reception of something higher. Not that there's anything wrong with emotions, but they have to be put in their proper place and controlled properly. Even in Scripture, we read that Christ had him when he cried, he was surprised, and so forth and so forth. And so there's nothing wrong with emotions. It's just that they have to be organized properly to that which is higher. So there's an organization or order, or like St. Thomas uses the word order in terms of or place of purgation.
Well, and so let me throw something in here. So I told you that the picture is of thermodynamics, in other words, entropy, learning, and memory. So let's say learning could take up the whole circle. If that happened, then instead of having positive entropy, you wouldn't have, instead of having entropy, you wouldn't have entropy. And life is sort of negative entropy, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So the only way you get from non-life to life is through that entropy loophole right there. You've got to get past, because life is sort of both. Life is negative entropy, and then positive entropy takes over once it gets going. But so if there's something about learning, I think, well, I was listening to Jess Purviance this morning on his, he had an episode called The Psychological Significance of Job. And it was so interesting talking about that the whole experience of Job was to teach us a pattern for healing. And so I think that learning part there is the healing that God wants to do in our lives, but it has to come through direct learning from him. And I think also that is somehow the passage from non-life to life has to do somehow with that learning, which I think is what you're talking about with interiority.
Right.
Yeah. One thing I was gonna jump in with is that like psychology coming from, the logos of the psyche, and spiritual. I mean, psyche and spiritual, it's just Greek and Latin roots for referring to the same thing. So like, to me, it doesn't surprise me at all that there's a lot of overlap there. Right.
Right. Yeah.
But Karen, the other thing I was going to suggest is, and I don't know that this is probably the time and place to get into it, but that notion of that exchange between what he's calling learning and memory, especially on the level of like base physical things. I think that's probably corresponds directly to the notion of potentiality and actuality that St. Thomas provides, with learning being something like potentiality, right? So you've got this sort of freedom to change and to move, and then memory, right, being like the state that it's been actualized.
Oh yeah. That totally makes
the habit,
sense.
yeah.
So
yeah, like playing a violin, yeah.
Yes.
You have the potential to play a violin, and you learn to play a violin, and then you've actualized that.
Yes.
But then so you've actualized the potential to learn it, but then there's the actually playing it. So once you're a master of a violin, doesn't mean you're always actually playing it. And so there's a couple different things. Yeah. And so there's the capacity to learn, which you've actualized once you're a master of the violin. Then once you've done that, then there's the actual playing it, which you go in and out of actualization and potency. So you're not always playing it.
Yeah. And then there's the whole movement of, say, any life, right? So any life, biological life, it does move from a state of, let's say, highest potentiality to total actuality when that life ends. And so we as creatures in this, yes and no. I mean, there's sorry, Dan. I know. I'm sure there's all sorts of things.
I'm getting older, and I sort of wonder, you're in certain ways your actuality physically, though, you're starting to go downhill the other way. So your actuality is being reversed. Intellectually, I think you continue to increase as long as there's no, as long as you don't start having, problems.
Right. Well, I guess to look at my own life, right? Like I couldn't go back and study something different in college, right? Like I've walked that path, and I've had the experiences of, the first 30 years of my life. Now I'm dramatically more capable than I was as a 5-year-old. Right. I get that because of how much I've actualized. That's what I mean. Like our young children, they don't know how to do almost any, like they can speak and walk and eat, and that's kind of it. And so there's this huge kind of inchoate, they're kind of like pluripotent stem cells at this point, right? To make a bad analogy.
Well, yeah, they have a greater, so what you've done is by actualizing, this points to the notion of hierarchy. By actualizing one thing or a handful of things, you've ignored the other thing. So you don't have as great a range as potentiality as you did when you were younger. You've sacrificed some of that for the actualization of various things. Like people talk about there's windows for like having a perfect perfect tonality in your ear, but you have to learn it by a certain age, and then you lose the ability to learn that. And or language, there's a window for language. People that have been raised by wolves or other things in the wild, when they're brought back and so forth, and they try to teach them, they just can't get language, never can get, because they've lost the potential, they've lost the window for. So there's various windows where you are more pluripotent, and then they get narrowed down, and that's because you're focusing on something. You're a hierarchical organism, and you're focusing on something, specified to move towards something higher, so to speak.
So I really like.
So Dan, have you ever run across the work of Michael Levin?
I heard you talking about him on that last podcast. Yeah, I've been wanting to sit down and read his stuff. I've read a little bit, but yeah, he's got fascinating stuff with that electrical field.
Yes. Well, one of his thoughts, one of his most recent thoughts, which I think bears some discussion, is that, and I mean, he's an evolutionist from the get-go, although he does think in very interesting ways about it. he says that what evolution has produced is not mechanisms of increasing complexity, but organisms that have within them the capacity to learn and adapt to whatever situation comes along. And that is why evolution moves upward.
Right.
You have entities with increasing adaptivity. And where he gets that is he's done these experiments with with frog skin cells where he's scraped them off and put them into a medium. So they're just frog skin cells. They have no other, supposedly no other potentiality. But what those frog skin cells do is they gather up into little entities, and they put their little, I don't know if they're cilia or what, there's little things on the skin cells. They put that towards the outside so that they can move around in the fluid. And if there are loose skin cells in the fluid, they'll gather them together into other little balls that move around. And he calls these things xenobots. So, but he can also, I don't remember the exact story, but it's something about signaling the frog embryo different ways, and sometimes like the same DNA of the frog he's working with, and yet a different frog will come out when it's signaled differently. And it might be a frog from way back in the past, not the current frog. And so with this electrical signaling, all sorts of potentialities are coming out that they never knew existed inside the DNA. And that's why he says what we're really provided with here is this opportunity to learn and adapt and become something else. And he thinks that may be limitless.
Right. That's essentially what you probably read more of I say I want to read Michael Levin. I haven't really, I'm familiar with some of the stuff that he's through other people talking about him. So you probably read more of them than I actually have.
I can, he has a couple of really good episodes that are just like a half an hour videos where he kind of collapses everything into one thing. I could send you one of those and save you a lot of reading time.
Okay. Yeah, sure. Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, I appreciate it. But, based on what you said, just going on what the way you read him. Yeah. So again, so what you're doing is you have a large amount of potentialities and you're focusing on one end. So there's another point you brought up. So that there's a distinction between hierarchy and complexity. Something that's not necessarily more complex isn't necessarily something hierarchically higher.
Yes.
Things can be, and that I think that's a critical distinction. Things can be more simple and hierarchically higher. And so a lot of people get complexity, particularly in the sciences, confused with hierarchy. And the two, while there is an overlap in certain areas, the two are distinct. So increasing complexity doesn't mean increasing hierarchy. Just from the standpoint of, the idea is, the idea of the sunlight produces multiple effects on the earth. So from the standpoint of light, you have this light of the sun, and it produces many different effects on the earth. It can warm something, it can cause a plant to grow, it can do, it can do multiple different, if you have a photovoltaic, it can cause electrical flow, it can cause, magnetic fields and so forth. So it has multiple effects. So something that, an organizer, which would be higher from that standpoint in hierarchically, isn't necessarily more complex. And so, going back to Levin with that, you have without having read, I don't want to try to.
Yeah. So it wasn't fair of me to ask you if you haven't.
No, it's perfectly fine.
Dan, can I pick up on something you said in there? And there's some ideas in your book that I'd love to hear you talk about, because one of the things that keeps hitting me with this biological discussion is exactly what you said: the difference between complexity and something's placed in the hierarchy. Do you want to talk about angelic, St. Thomas Aquinas' notion of angelic intelligence? Because I think there's that movement towards simplicity as you move up the
That's a
hierarchy.
good point. Yeah. So you and I learn by let's say, I don't know the notion of a dog. You and I learn by, there's many dogs we run into during our life, and then we sort of take all those particulars and come to the general idea of what a dog is. We have a generic notion for dogness in our mind based on our experience of all the dogs we run into. So that's because that's called a rational being. We're sort of like the Homer Simpsons of the intelligence in terms of the universe. We plod from one thing to the next. We go from point A to point B to point C, and then we conclude to this idea. And according philosophically, it's not just theologically, but the Greek, Aristotle and Plato, the same idea. So that from that an angel they would call a separated substance. The idea, what they have is the idea of the thing, like they have the idea of dogness in their mind, and we would say theologically it's given to them by God at the moment of their creation, and they can conclude immediately to every possible dog that ever existed, so that they know in a snap. So the closest experience, there's an old saying going back, I think Dionysius the Areopagite has the lower at its best approximate the higher at its lowest. So we have what's called a rational intellect. Angels have called an intuitive intellect. And so probably the best approximations, if you're studying something a lot, you're preparing for an exam, and I've had this, I know students have had this. So you're studying, and all of a sudden, based on your studying, you understand the bigger picture, and then all of a sudden it reorganizes everything that you've been studying. All of a sudden, oh yeah, I see how everything fits. And so that's sort of our best approximation of what we call angelic intuition. So they're given the idea, and they can conclude to all the particulars in an instant. And so, if they're given the idea of a human, they know every single human that ever existed, and just immediately from that. And so let's call it. And St. Thomas actually says that's the proper way an intelligence is supposed to work. So they have the simple idea, like you were talking about, and then they conclude all the complexity after that. So they understand everything that entails from that. Where we're just the opposite. We have to have the complexity, and then we conclude to something higher.
So there's a couple of really interesting points worth bringing up there. One is, right, so there's the church is very clear on the notion of divine simplicity, which,
right.
Darren, to go back to some of the conversations you've had about being versus becoming, and this sort of desire for this sort of dynamic divine or something like that, right? When you contemplate these, you realize that as you move towards the angels, and one of the other things that I recall is the angels that are higher in the higher angelic hierarchy, they actually have simpler ideas, right? So there's so the difference between like being given the idea of dog versus the idea of animal, right? The idea of animal in one sense is more simple, but it contains within itself vastly more than dog. But there's this. So one of the things that struck me at one point, and this is just some interesting insight that I hadn't heard anywhere else, is when you look at, right, so I think it's hard to deny that humans are the most complex organisms on the planet, on at least one.
Complex thing in creation, period.
Right. Okay. Yeah. Okay, great. I agree with that too. So what's weird though is we don't have we have pretty small genomes compared to a lot of plants, and so there's this weird like non-correspondence between certain like behavioral and adaptive complexities and the quantity of DNA that an organism contains.
Right.
And one of the things that struck me is, so here in Arkansas we've got hills and then bottoms, and you'll find, say, like I think it's eastern white pine that we've got here. And you can go up on in the Ozarks, and they'll be growing on the top, and they'll be 20 feet tall, and these gnarled tiny trees that have been living for like 130 years. And then more or less genetically identical to that, you'll go down to the bottoms, and there's this 40-year-old tree that's I can't put my arms around, and it is 90 feet tall. And it's like, well, because plants don't have the capacity to move around in the environment, they have to contain all that adaptivity genetically so that they can develop in radically different physiological routes. And so there's this weird thing where as you move up the hierarchy, the more interior the organism's life is, it can actually be more simple, because say a dog can just get up and move somewhere warmer, right? And so there's this weird, you can even see that biologically, where as there's greater interiority, there's actually the possibility of, so we don't have to like in terms of what we can actualize in the world around us, I don't have to have the muscles that can move boulders, right? And I don't have to have the legs that can run at 60 miles an hour. There's all these things, we develop these capacities that are actually connected to, there's this sort of movement towards the simplicity of just the intellect. You don't have to have all the physical capacities to do all the things that we can. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I don't want to.
So much.
Yeah, I was gonna say with DNA, I don't want to generate, because there's no core. There's always an exception with DNA in terms of how much DNA you have is not necessarily correlated with how complex you are. There's because that's a whole different conversation. So
I don't want to go anywhere more than to just break that notion that people have. More complex means more DNA.
Well, the beautiful picture that you drew of the trees at the top and the trees at the bottom, because the trees at the top are adapting to their environment because they're subjected to so much difficulty and struggle and suffering compared to the trees at the bottom.
Right. Yeah.
Right. And I think this also is a part of the whole hierarchy thing somehow. But I wanted to tie this in with what Dan was saying about there's something that is drawing everything upward, and this thing which draws that the most simple beyond all, let's say God, it might be love. It might be love that's drawing everything. God is love. So, but that would indicate that all of this potential for adaptivity, so right now there's only so many different kinds of dogs, but every kind of dog that ever could be can be part of that which is being drawn. So the drawing itself is opening this potential. So when Levin talks about how these organisms have evolved this wonderful process of extra adaptivity, what he's really saying is there is way more potential available in every living being than scientists had any idea was there. And now they're discovering it. And that is all because the one who is drawing us all towards himself, maybe like Ted was saying about the more that there are to enjoy the ultimate union, the more there will be to enjoy in the ultimate union. So the increasing, I don't know if you call it complexity or just the increasing adaptivity and potentiality that is continually growing all the time because of that drawing is always drawing us upward.
Well, the old notion of, you mentioned knowledge and aiming upward. The old notion of knowledge, according to the Greeks, is the idea that a piece of clay has a possibility of many different shapes. So I can mold any different material shape into a piece of clay. I can any number of different things. Butterfly, a dog, a vase, a sculpture of a camel, whatever I want to put into a piece of clay. The idea of the intelligence is actually it's a type of clay for spiritual reality. So the intellect is that which, when contacts the spiritual reality, becomes that thing. So the old notion of you become that which you know, and so they viewed that in a literal way, that the intellect is that which is like a spiritual, for lack of a better term, like a spiritual clay. So it comes in contact with something, with a spiritual reality, and it literally becomes that which it knows. And so they would argue that's only the way that you truly can know something is to become. I think that's portrayed in science fiction. Curiously, I used to watch Star Trek quite a bit, and the old Deep Space Nine with the shapeshifters. And I don't know if you follow the storyline, but the idea is that there's the idea that they would sort of fuse with one another, and they would know everything about the thing they fuse with, so because they'd literally become that which they were trying to know. And in reality, that's really what the Greeks and really the Christian tradition also picked up from the Greeks on that, is that the intellect is not so much a capacity necessarily to know this fact or that fact, but it's like a lump of clay that can become that which it's spiritually that's coming in contact with. And so from that point also, we're human beings are the highest aspect of the physical universe, because we draw all things by knowing material things. We draw all things into us.
This seems like a great place to try to dive into the third part of the book, image of eternity.
Okay, just let me ask one more question before we do. We'll get to the third part. So I just have to bring up another thing about Michael Levin that he always talks about is, let's say you have a bilateral organism like a frog. And the way he always describes it is, it starts out as these undifferentiated cells, and then they start talking to each other via this bioelectrical signaling, and some of the cells are sent off to build an arm and the other arm, and some cells are sent off to build an eye, and the subroutine kicks in. When you do the electrical stimulus to stimulate this thing to make it do something different, you don't have to know how to build an arm. You just have to know what stimulus is going to get it building that arm, because that subroutine to build an arm is already there in the frog. But when the frog begins to, if you don't mess with the frog at all, when it begins to build its arms, or whatever you call them on a frog, legs, frog legs, I guess.
Legs and arms.
Yeah. They will grow bilaterally the way they're supposed to, identical to one another, except for the chirality. First of all, he says, why is that? And second of all, he says, why do they stop growing? How do they know when to stop growing so that they're the same size on both sides? Because apparently there's nothing in the DNA that gives that information. The DNA only explains how to build the proteins. And when you were talking about that which draws, and then you're saying you can only become that which you know. And I've been thinking a lot about this idea of memory, habit, and pattern having to have something to do with that. There's something built into the organism that is helping it search that space to know how far to go and when to stop.
Yeah, that would be, so that would be called its formal cause, or in its final cause, which is interior to the thing. So for instance,
does science say anything about that, or is it only Aristotle that says something about that?
Okay, there's 2 or 3 questions here on that. Well, and then I want to come back to Ted, because I want to get a little bit more to the third. Let's see if I can hit. Okay, so the idea of that's a very critical distinction that the Western philosophical tradition has made, throughout its history, is, so you have a glass, like a cup that's made out of glass, versus a figure of a horse that's made out of glass. So they both have the same material, but what differentiates them? There's another cause that's differentiating them, and that is the form of the shape. And so the Western philosophical tradition picked up on that and said there's a formal cause. And so the formal cause in a thing like a glass cup or a glass horse is put in there by an external agent. It's external to the thing. In other words, it's sort of imposed on the glass. Whereas in living things, it's interior to that. It's that which guides their development. So back to your notion about Michael Levin and frogs, the formal cause of the frog is making the thing to have legs and stopping its development at a certain point. It's that which and so they picked up the notion of a shape in an artificial thing and say this is how we understand nature also, that it has a formal causality to it. And I don't know, maybe a good point of discussion beyond this, maybe it acts through electric fields. So he's a little familiar I have with him, as I know he's saying a lot of things about electric fields in the development of an organism. And there actually is again, a total side point here. There is the notion of electric universe, which there are certain physicists talking about that
Yeah,
electricity.
I've talked to Michael Claridge a few times. Yeah,
Oh, you have?
Yeah.
Oh, I'd love to be able to talk with them at some point. In their
Oh, that would be great. Let me set that up.
This is what Karen does.
Yeah, that would be
Okay.
terrific.
But now, do scientists know? Because what does science do? So I would say Levin is right on the border of science and philosophy based on what he's doing. Science is the discipline of quantity, and a substantial form doesn't have quantity to it. It's a type of cause. It's the matter that has quantity to it. And so it's beyond the object of strictly scientific research. And so no, most scientists don't even don't isn't even on they don't think about substantial form or final cause, because they really aren't quantifiable. It's matter that's quantifiable, and in the instantiations of a final cause in matter, that particular instance. And so like mathematics will talk about a perfect triangle, but you can't scientifically discover a perfect triangle. There's no way of doing that. No matter how sophisticated your science is, it would be absolutely impossible to ever discover a perfect triangle, because what does it mean to be a perfect triangle? It means the sides are exactly equal. Well, what measuring device are you going to have that could ever tell you that? Because you could say, well, it's the same number of inches. Well, okay, there's something smaller than an inch, it's a quarter an inch, or same number of centimeters, but then there's millimeters, and then there's micrometers, and then there's femtometers, and and there's the distance of an electron. What exactly am I causing? What exactly am I using as a measure for exactness? You could always go down to something lower in matter, and so you could never really scientifically measure or know a perfect triangle. It's known from something else. It's known from mathematics. And so it's beyond. So things like formal and final causality are beyond the extent of science to talk about. They talk about particular instances of things, and that's what they do, is they go out and they measure particularities. And so how would they know that there's 180 degrees in a triangle? Well, they go out and they measure all the instances of a triangle they can find, and they add it up and they divide by the number, and they get 180. They might get 180.2, they might get 179.5, but they could never know perfection per se from the basis of that methodology. It'd be mathematics that you would know, which is not, strictly speaking, even though you use mathematics in science, but the discipline of math is something different than science. So, and I would say I think Levin is particularly interesting, what little I've had, because I think he really is running on the border of science and philosophy.
Yeah, he started having conversations with Ian McGilchrist and another very interesting guy that's in biology and computer science that you might enjoy talking to, Richard Watson. I'm going to have a conversation with him next month, and maybe later on I can connect up the two of you. He puts on his academic website that he looks into biology and computer science and love.
Okay,
well, that's a bold move.
Fascinating.
Yeah.
Dan,
let's move into part 3, shall we?
15 minutes to cover or whatever, however much time we've got.
Sort of field it as best as you get going as best as you can.
Sorry, say that again.
I said you sort of had, like, you had a question about part 3. Field that, and let's see if we get it going.
No, I mean, it was personally the most impactful to me. I mean, I think previous to this, the ability to finally do some real work of integrating my biology background and the Christian faith, that was pretty groundbreaking. But when this notion of the relationship between reality structurally and the liturgical work of the church, and that's connection to the eschaton. I mean, that was depth charges in my brain that started going off and just didn't stop. So and when you and when I asked you about this, you basically said you wrote the book for this, like, this is what you wanted to convey.
That's part 3. Yeah, that I was trying to build up to. But I think it's funny because I talked to a historical theologian I got to know fairly well. I lived out in California, and he said this was sort of the default idea that people had about reality.
Yeah.
Up till just several hundred years ago. And so but now it's totally unfamiliar to people. And so I tried to build the notion. How well I succeed, I guess I succeeded with you, but how well I succeeded in general, I tried to build it up from things that people are more familiar with to be able to talk about part three. So I started out with science, and actually, interestingly, I had written the book the opposite direction. So I had started out with part three and then worked my way back down. And then an editor said, nobody's going to get this if you do it this. So I flipped it around 180, redo the whole thing 180 degrees. And so I guess how well it paid off. Yeah.
Isn't that kind of funny? Because the whole notion is that let's say liturgical completion and that union with God is the thing that's drawing all of creation.
Right.
And so you went in with that, and you had to go in and write everything else to that. And so the book ended up kind of actually, like, the process of making the book actually mirrors the thing itself, which I love.
Yeah. Well, it mirrors that art example I think you mentioned before of in the previous podcast about, looking at it from the standpoint of the materials. The materials are being put together and drawn toward the final image. But so that is the idea of the ultimate idea of the book is that everything's being drawn into this notion of deification, which the fathers should become God by participation. So you're not, things are being, all intellectual creatures, humans and angels and so forth are being what is called deified. They're being drawn into where St. Peter talks about in his letter in the Bible, where he says, become sharers in the divine nature. So things are being becoming God by participation. So the distinction is, we're not God by nature. We'd be called heretics if we said that, because only God's God by nature, but he gives them the divine life. He makes them sharers in who he is. And the Catholic Catechism in particular actually explicitly states that. It comments on several saints, and it says, God became man. Saint Athanasius's idea, God became man so that man might become God.
Yeah. Well, then, I want to, if you don't mind, for just a second, because for me, so I grew up as a Protestant Christian that was somewhere between, sort of Baptist Pentecostal and a little bit of maybe more Reformed theology, and so it wasn't like I was ignorant in any of these things. But this notion, what you're touching at there, I think, is a really profound distinction about the end of human life, and so taking end is like that which it's leading towards, not just like the termination. It's not the termination, it's the completion, right? So first of all, the notion that there's a completion rather than a termination. And the picture that I think that I had always had was this sort of, let's say, everything now but better kind of picture.
Right.
So this notion is that, right, so what happens in the Christian story is that God becomes man, and in that process opens up a way to resolve all of, let's say, the failure and the brokenness of created order as it is. Right. And in the end, it's all going to be reestablished appropriately. So it's very much this, like, let's say, reinstitution of Eden. It's something like that, right? So Dan, I want to let you know, this is where I'm coming from. I'm
just thinking. I'm
yeah.
Thinking.
Okay. So then when I came across,
excuse me, because I was just sort of rolling around.
I don't know if that was your interjecting phase or not.
No, I wasn't supposed to be. I was just started thinking and trying to figure something you were saying, and so yeah.
So when I came across, and you're just very straightforward with it. Like, look, this is what the Church Fathers said. This is what continues to be held by the Catholic Church. That the end of man is something actually profoundly different from that. It's not that part's eliminated, but that everything is just going is up way more than we could possibly imagine. And so there's a couple of things that did in my life. One is, and I think when we spoke, or maybe I talked about this in one of the podcasts, but what it did to me, first of all, was it actually organized my entire life now. And I don't want to in any way reduce, say, the notion of theosis or deification to what it does for me now. But as, let's say, an indication that I'm on the right track, all of a sudden it opened up the possibility of valuing individual human souls in a way that I hadn't before. Because let's say I had propositionally known, people are individually created by God and they're valuable, but I'm like, I don't, because Because look, the gap between myself and God, or between my wife and God, or between my friend and God is infinite, obviously. And so it's like, in a sense, there's this thing at the back of my head that's like, how is it worthwhile to give attention to anyone, right? And again, you see this too with the total expurgation of the communion of saints from the Protestant tradition, which is, I would say, by and large, or completely lost the notion of divinization. Because why would you give any attention to the saints? Really, like, just all of your attention. I mean, this is what I hear all the time is, well, why would I ever take my attention down from God? And what deification does is it says, look, there's a sense in which all of those things are going to be participating in the value of the divine.
Right.
And that does all kinds of things. And so one of the things,
that's why you go into Orthodox Church, not to interrupt you, but you go into Orthodox, you see the iconostasis screen, the notion that they're the examples on how to approach God, so they're there for a reason.
Yeah, exactly.
That's, and if people aren't familiar, you go into an Orthodox or an Eastern Catholic church, between the altar and the people, there's a screen with icon images of different saints, and it has a hierarchical ordering of those, and it's because they're the exemplar, it's supposed to be the deified exemplar of what you are to become. Notice the transfiguration. So that there's an old saying in the Eastern Church, when Christ, when the transfiguration, the light from the transfiguration, and since God is outside of time and Christ is God, the light of Tabor, the light of the transfiguration, ordered, went out from there forward and backwards through time and organized the whole of reality to being drawn in to prepare it to being deified.
Wow. Yeah, so to take the Eastern churches again, as a Catholic convert, obviously, the veneration of the Blessed Virgin Mary was, let's say, out of my wheelhouse initially. And so going to some, Eastern Catholic Church, and to some Orthodox churches before conversion, there's, Dan, I'm sure you're familiar with this, the image of Our Lady with the child Christ in the middle of her, right? This is often and for those who went to the Chino conference and went to St. Andrew's Orthodox Church, there's around that, it was painted, it said, more spacious than the cosmos, about Our Lady. Right. So there's this notion of Our Lady as being, I've heard this in the Western tradition, as being, let's say, totally transparent to God, right? So totally translucent. Right. She's totally translucent. And so there's, you start to get in this place where, because you have to, ultimately, all of your attention has to be on God. It does. Yeah. And I don't disagree with that. But how do you resolve that with the fact that there's good creation? And I think that you resolve that on let's say, an attentional level with this notion of deification, that God, that creation is going to participate in the divine nature.
Right.
It's and then there's no longer that conflict.
Yeah. Right? Because that's the whole notion that matter is the whole notion of the incarnation. Matter is being perfused with divinity. I mean, everything to a greater or less degree is being divinized. That's the idea. And going back to the future, that's why it's called the image of eternity. The church is the reconstituted creation that is organizing through its efforts, is that all of creation is being drawn and divinized up into this reality. And I first came across this when I read John of the Cross. So when I was about 25 or 26 years old, I read John of the Cross, and I was like, it just blew me away. And it he talked about, he said God, in a sense, is coming down to man and drawing him up to him to make, so God wants to call you his child. He wants to call you his lover. I mean, you get this thing in the Song of, I was talking with somebody the other day, the Song of Songs in the Bible. I said, how this piece of erotic literature get in the Bible, and it's like, well, when you look at it from the standpoint of divinization, so you're the child of God, you're the brother of God, and you're the spouse of God. And so it really is talking about God, the type of relationship that God wants you. And John of the Cross goes so far as to say, God reaches down to man and tries to draw him up in a certain way to make him equal with himself, so he can have a relationship. I mean, I can't have the relationship with I have ducks. I can't have a relationship with a duck that I have with my kids.
Yeah.
Level of an organism, there's no way that you can have that, And so in a sense, he's reaching down and he's giving us a share in his life and drawing us up into, he's not making us who he is by nature, but by the word the church uses is by participation. So he's given us a certain equivalence with himself in a certain type of way such that he can enter into this, so the Song of Songs is a real love song about how the relationship he wants with you, and
so Dan, I heard this recently, and I found this fascinating. So obviously you've got the Gospels and then the Psalm, but in terms of recorded sermons that we have through the history of the church, the most are preached on the Gospels, and then after that the Psalms, and then the next book that was preached on the most from the recorded homilies we have is Song of Songs.
Right. I mean, a lot of the church thought Origen, Gregory Nyssa made comments that
So then again to come to this with a little bit, maybe some eyes that are seeing the difference there because of how my life has gone. So that in these Eucharistic celebrations, so with the Mass and the Divine Liturgy, when we say that we're going to participate in the divine life of the Trinity, and honestly, it was actually you walking through some of the Trinitarian theology in your book, talking about that. This is the first time I heard any of this stuff, and I've heard it in other places now too. But when you have the notion of the real presence of Christ, the transubstantiated Eucharist, what's going on, right? Because what does the Son do is he offers himself to the Father, right? The Father sends forth the Son, and the Son offers himself to the Father. And what's happening when you're in these Eucharistic celebrations at the Mass or the Divine Liturgy is like God gives us the Son so that we can give him back to the Father, which is what the Son's doing. So like on an actual level, like we're getting to do the same thing that the Son does for the Father, which is to give himself to and so
exactly,
So we get that now. Like that's what's so crazy is that what do they call it? The perichoresis, the inner movement of the Trinity.
Yeah.
Like we're being pulled into that.
Exactly. Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. That's what John of the Cross says. We're being pulled right into that dynamic. Now we're not just being pulled into it. We're actually given a real participation in it.
Yes.
And so the Eastern, the Orthodox liturgy has a point in there just after the consecration about giving. You mentioned the idea of being given Christ so we can give Christ back to God in the same way. Give back to the Father in the same way that happens in the Trinity. It actually says after the consecration, we offer you yours of your own for all.
Yes. Yeah. That's right. I use joke in the best way possible. Like that is the joke of all created reality. That like we give God his own. He lets us he lets us give him his own. Like if you could just get that, then
But and so that's actually the remote reason I wrote the book. Is if you get back to the original question you had, Karen, at the beginning, why did I write the book? I read John of the Cross when I was 25, and I read this notion of deification. I thought, if this is true, this has got to somehow perfuse all the way down into the lowest reaches of creation because it's such a fantastic idea. And so that's why I wrote the book. Was as a scientist, how do I show this as a scientist? That's what I tried to do. I don't know how well I succeeded, but that was my ultimate reason for it.
Well, look, Dan, you did a good enough job that when I was 25 or 26, I wrote about deification in your book, and it, so we'll see what I come up with.
You can carry on the torch after I'm gone.
That's fantastic.
Well, I think that's one of the reasons that I harp on this a lot, that somehow marriage is one of the very fundamental things that's at the heart of all of reality. And that
right. I mean, St. Paul uses this marriage as an example of this whole thing.
Yeah.
Right. So Christ is preparing his bride.
Right.
And we're being prepared to come into union with him, and he is making us to be spotless and blameless so that we are of the same nature, so that we can come into union with him. But we often talk about how we are marred by sin. And if we think about the sin as being the hamartia, is that the correct pronunciation for that? The missing the mark?
Yeah.
I've been mulling this idea that forgiveness is actually a way of helping us to forget the missing of the mark, to forget all the times we've missed the mark, so that memory isn't holding us back, so that he can take our hand and walk us through the next time that we're aiming at the mark and
Yeah.
he can be our aim, and he can, help our hands, so that more and more that this forgiveness washes away the past and puts our sins as far as the east is from the west, then we have new opportunity to move forward into this new learning. So forgiveness is sort of an unlearning of sin, and
Right.
and a learning of our future glory with him.
Right.
It's funny. There's an Italian poet actually from about 700 years ago who wrote about exactly that.
Oh, is that Dante's Inferno?
So yeah,
Right?
well,
I mean, I have not read that, so I don't have any.
it's not in the Inferno actually. It's at the end of Purgatorio, where he gets up to the earthly paradise, and there's two rivers there, and there's these sort of baptism scenes, and one of them, all of the memory of his sin is washed away, and then the other one, all of the memory of all of the good deeds that he's done is strengthened. So it's exactly that, what you're saying. And now, what's interesting is I think it's Leith that washes away the memories of his sin. That's the river that goes down and eventually, I believe, ends up in the very pit of hell. Let's say, with all the sins washed away from the world that Satan is frozen in. But that twin notion of forgetting your evil and let's say strengthening the memory of the good, that's right there. And then Beatrice takes him by the hand and they ascend into heaven in this increasingly clarified vision of the Trinity, of the divine Trinity. So yeah, Dante was on that path.
No, Dante's great. Yeah, my daughter read him in high school and read him in college, and she yeah
He's worth working over a lot of times, I think.
Yeah.
I have a lot of stuff on my reading list. Well, so Daniel, I'm sorry we didn't give you sufficient time to really go into part 3.
Oh, that's okay. That's the way these things work. So
maybe we can cover a little bit more of it when we have the conversation with Michael Claridge. You guys,
I'd love to.
You guys will have a lot to talk about. I can send you. I did an episode with him on the triples, and it was really interesting. All the different triples that show up in science and in philosophy.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, if you set up a conversation with him for me, I'd appreciate it. Yeah.
Yeah, that will be really exciting. Well, thank you, Ted, for introducing me to Dr. Toma. I'm big with titles too. I have this thing about authority. So it always feels hard to call you Dan, but
oh well.
Yeah. And Dr. Toma, thank you, in a public space. Really, I really appreciate the book you wrote. And
well, thanks a lot. I appreciate it.
Yeah, you just never know. And I think Karen and I's last conversation, I think I ended with a little bit of a diatribe, is that positive, on the notion of obedience, and not demanding that where your obedience ends up. And so your right. obedience in writing that book, and the years that went into it, it's gone out into the world, and it's, you don't know right, we're all being drawn towards the future.
Oh yeah,
the conclusion, and I'm interested to see where it goes with me and my wife and our children and our children's children, and so on. So thank you.
No, thanks a lot. I appreciate it. And Karen, I really appreciate the opportunity to speak and to talk and to dialogue with the two of you.
This was super fun. Thank you both, guys. We'll talk to you soon.
Okay.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.